Lena had recently started working the night shift at an old, sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. At first, the job seemed unremarkable, just another paycheck to get by. The building itself was large, cold, and filled, with towering stacks of inventory. The hum of machines and the flickering fluorescent lights above created a strangely peaceful atmosphere for someone used to solitude. Her supervisors were distant, and the other workers seemed to drift in and out, hardly taking notice of her. As a recent college graduate, Lena was eager to start her career, but she quickly realized that the late-night shifts were a bit more isolating than she had anticipated. The company's schedule often meant she was working alone for long stretches, as most of her colleagues worked during the day. The eerie quiet of the warehouse was only punctuated by the occasional clang of metal or the distant sound of machines running in the background. But something about the warehouse unnerved Lena. There was an air of decay, as though it was a place that had been long forgotten by time. She couldn't quite place it, but every night, when she found herself alone among the tall shelves and boxes, a subtle dread would creep in. At first, Lena brushed off the discomfort as mere anxiety. After all, it was a new job in an unfamiliar environment. She convinced herself that it was just the odd nature of working overnight. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was as though the warehouse held secrets it was desperate to keep hidden, and Lena had unknowingly become part of that story. After a few weeks of working nights, Lena started noticing strange occurrences. It began subtly, small things that she could dismiss as imagination. But with each passing night, the oddities grew more intense. One night, while organizing inventory in the back corner of the warehouse, Lena heard a faint whisper. At first, it was so quiet she thought it was the wind or a distant creak in the building. But the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Leave. Now." Lena froze, looking around at the empty aisles. She had always been alone during her shifts, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just a random sound or an illusion. It felt like someone, or something, was directly addressing her. Her heart began to pound in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see another worker, but the aisle was empty. Her pulse raced as she checked the other corners of the warehouse, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only silence. A cold, unsettling silence. Despite her growing unease, Lena tried to convince herself it was nothing. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, shaking her head. The building was old, and it creaked and groaned, as if it were alive. But deep down she knew this was something more. The whispers continued the following night. At first they were soft, barely perceptible, like a distant murmur. But as the nights wore on, the voices became clearer, closer, and more insistent. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her. "Leave," it whispered each time. "You shouldn't be here." As the whispers became louder and more frequent, Lena's anxiety turned into full-blown fear. Every night she would brace herself before entering the warehouse, her hands trembling as she punched in the security code to unlock the gates. The eerie feeling of being watched never left her. She couldn't help but feel that the shadows held something lurking just beyond her line of sight. One night, while walking down one of the long aisles, Lena felt a sudden, intense cold on the back of her neck. It wasn't the typical chill of the warehouse. This was a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into her skin. She spun around quickly, but no one was there. Her breath came out in a fog, though it wasn't cold enough in the warehouse to warrant that. And that's when she heard it again. A faint whisper, almost like a breath brushing against her ear. "Leave. Leave. Her body froze in place. She stood there motionless, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that she was tired, and the hours were getting to her. But she could not shake the sensation that something was following her, that something was watching her every move. The shelves felt like they were closing in on her, the air thick with an unseen presence. She quickly finished her tasks that night and fled, her heart racing. But as she drove home, she couldn't rid herself of the feeling that the warehouse was still there, pulling at her from the darkness. One particularly cold night, when the air inside the warehouse seemed even chillier than usual, Lena's fear reached a peak. She was in the farthest corner of the warehouse, where the lighting was dim and the shadows stretched long across the floor. As she walked past one row of shelves, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A figure, barely visible but unmistakably there. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman, but there was something wrong about her. Her body was unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, and her eyes were hollow black pits. Her clothes hung from her frame in tatters, and she seemed to move in a way that defied the natural flow of human motion. The figure was standing just beyond a row of boxes, staring at Lena. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move for a moment, just stood there in the shadows, watching her. Then it smiled. But the smile was wrong. Twisted, too wide, like it was stretched across a face that shouldn't be able to express such a thing. The sight of it made Lena's stomach churn with dread. Before she could react, the figure spoke in a voice that sounded like the whispering she had been hearing for days. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words slow and drawn out, dripping with malice. The figure stepped forward and Lena took a step back, her feet heavy as though they were sinking into the floor. The woman's smile widened and her black eyes locked onto Lena's with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The temperature around Lena plummeted and she felt as though the very air had turned to ice. It was as if the world had stopped, and only the figure in front of her existed. "You're like me now," the woman said, her voice an unsettling whisper that seemed to fill the entire warehouse. "I worked here once too, late at night, all alone, just like you." The woman took another slow step forward, her fingers long and twisted. "But I never left, and now, neither will you." Lena could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her body frozen in place. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure reached out a hand toward her, its fingers impossibly long and crooked. She could hear the air crackle with tension as the figure's presence seemed to swallow the space around her. "Leave. Now. Before it's too late," the woman hissed, her face twisting in agony as she stepped closer. Lena's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She wasn't sure how she managed to break free from the figure's gaze, but she bolted. Her feet slammed against the concrete floor as she raced toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps following her, and the woman's haunting laughter echoing through the aisles. Each step Lena took seemed to take her farther from the exit and deeper into the maze-like expanse of the warehouse. The shelves loomed above her, and the shadows stretched like dark hands reaching for her. She had no idea where she was going, but all she could do was run. The air felt thicker with each passing second, suffocating her. She could feel the cold from the woman's presence closing in on her, pressing in from all sides. Her chest was tight with fear, but she couldn't stop. Her eyes locked onto the exit doors in the distance. They were just ahead. She was almost there. With one final burst of energy, she sprinted toward the door, her heart pounding. As she reached for the handle, she heard the whisper again, this time louder than ever. "You can't escape." With a forceful push, she threw open the door and stumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath. But the fear didn't leave her. It clung to her like a shadow, following her as she ran down the street away from the warehouse. The next day, Lena didn't return for her shift. Her manager thought she had just quit, but something didn't sit right with the other workers. They noticed that her ID badge was still hanging in her locker, her car was still parked outside, and the usual pile of paperwork was untouched. A few workers decided to investigate, and when they entered the warehouse, they immediately felt the temperature drop. The building felt wrong, like something was watching them. As they walked deeper into the aisles, the whispers began, faint but unmistakable. One of the workers spoke, but the others couldn't hear him over the whispers. "You shouldn't be here." He shivered, glancing around nervously. The whispers grew, louder, more insistent, like a rising chorus. "Leave now, you're not supposed to be here." The workers quickly turned and fled, but as they left, they felt the oppressive weight of the warehouse lingering on their shoulders. Lena never returned to the warehouse. No one knew what happened to her, but her disappearance wasn't the last strange event tied to the building. The workers continued to hear the whispers at night, and though they tried to ignore it, each passing night seemed to draw more and more of the warehouse's dark history into their reality. The whispers grew louder, and sometimes workers would see fleeting glimpses of the woman in the shadows, her hollow eyes and twisted grin following them wherever they went. And so, the warehouse stood, empty but full of a presence that refused to leave, waiting for the next lonely soul to work its night shifts to become part of its unending haunting story.